We have therefore the definition of starter homes. We have a mechanism for its delivery, potentially a success, but I think it does raise some issues which perhaps I can now discuss with my colleagues here. The first question I've put there is, will it be attractive to consumers? And by that I mean, will it be attractive to young people looking to get on the housing market, to become homeowners? I think the simple answer to that is yes, so long as they are likely to want to remain at that house for the 5 or 8 year period. If they think during that period they want to move on, if the restrictions on sale are fairly draconian, then it may well act as a disincentive. But at the end of the day, many young people are only too delighted to buy a property at 80% of the market value and in due course be able to sell it at 100% of that market value without making a repayment. So to that extent, it's clearly a winner in my eyes. Having said that, let's look at the second point there. What are the issues for developers? Rather than me give my view on this, Clive, Iain, what do you think in terms of how developers are going to react?
Thanks, David. I think it's, to use that horrible phrase, the devil is in the detail, and we're still waiting for the regulations, which I think will be very important. But in broad terms, I think that the starter homes principle is welcomed by developers, depending on local economic conditions in terms of whether this is going to add more value to schemes that they're bringing forward, and also the attitude and approach of the local planning authority. As you touched upon in your presentation, David, this is quite an interventionist approach in that starter homes are now going to be required, not just suggested, as forming part of the affordable housing mix delivered by local planning authorities in their area. And it's clear that some local authorities are going to be more keen on this than others. That will then have an effect on what they're also going to be requiring by way of traditional affordable housing, if I can put it like that. So developers may end up having to provide starter homes as a national government requirement, but also a percentage of traditional affordable housing, whether that's social rent or other forms of shared ownership or shared equity accommodation, in addition to that starter home requirement. And I think during the transitional period, whilst this settles down, there is going to be some uncertainty for landowners, developers and local authorities as to where that balance is going to be struck. I think the other element of concern for developers is around the market for starter homes. I think obviously in some areas very strong, in other areas less so. One of the risks that developers will now be taking on is the absorption rate of these units, because they will effectively keep these units on their books until they are sold or transferred to a starter home purchaser. And that can be contrasted with the situation perhaps up until now, where there's often a bulk sale to a registered provider or an RSL of the affordable housing units, which provides a capital receipt and certainty for the delivery of that project. Starter homes are a different animal, and therefore we're going to have to see how that market develops. I think, Clive, you had some comments on issues for local authorities.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, David, very much for the overview. Policing, David, is one thing that certainly comes to mind. I mean, those of us that are as old as I will perhaps remember the right to buy in the 1980s, and there seems to be a slight echo, perhaps, of that with this concept. Certainly, clawback comes to mind in relation to right to buy, which threw up issues. The other point, I think, is, and again Iain has touched on this, you can only get so much out of a development, and if there's going to be an obligation to provide starter homes plus an obligation to provide general affordable housing, be it rented or shared equity, how is the decision going to be made as which trumps which? Presumably starter homes.
I see quite a difficult balance, because the developer is going to look at his gross development value. That's almost his starting point in reverse, so to speak. And if he's got to sell some houses at 20% less than the market value, and he's got to negotiate with a registered provider for affordable housing, it must affect his gross development value, and he's still got to have his profit level for taking the risk, particularly in perhaps uncertain times. I did read some research which suggested that 20% of if there was a 20% requirement for starter homes, that could have a significant impact in some areas on the provision of affordable homes. The other area which I think may be quite interesting is, of course, starter homes, most first-time purchasers are going to want a mortgage, and it's going to be interesting to see what reaction mortgagees take it, and as I've mentioned before, what responsibilities they impose on solicitors dealing with that. But in overall terms, let's try and think what's going to happen. Do we think starter homes is going to achieve the government's objective of delivering more homes for people to actually live in? Perhaps go to Clive first.
Yes, the million-dollar question. It certainly isn't going to be a step change. I think it could have some impact at the margins. I think it's a interesting development, a step in the right direction, but one mustn't get too carried away with just the introduction of the idea. Looking at the ramifications down the line, as you've both touched upon, are important points of detail which may determine the success or otherwise of the venture.
Iain.
I think it will depend on the attitude of local authorities and the attitude of the development industry. I think there's a danger that it might form part of the mix, but there might not be any overall net increase. I think we might see some early activity, as we've seen on some public land sites, but I think that probably on balance we'll see a settling down. We'll see starter homes forming part of the mix, but perhaps not delivering the numbers which government would like to see.
I don't fundamentally disagree with that. I think we will see some starter homes produced. They will be attractive to some, but I do have reservations as to whether it will actually increase the number of houses actually built within the country.
So politically highly charged as always. Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you very much, David, for your expert insight today.